The house that didn't want anyone to live in it. It was a bright Saturday morning, and the Wholesons were up very early. Everyone was too excited to sleep late because Dad and Peggy hadn't seen the new house, but their parents had told them it was a big old home perched on a hill. As soon as they were dressed, they ran downstairs for breakfast. Then there was their own last-minute packing to do. They wanted to be ready when the moving men came. When they finally finished, Dan and Peggy had everything packed into 3 big cartons, and just in time, too, because the dog began to bark excitedly at the moving van pulling up to the house. It was a several hours' drive to the new house, and so it was late afternoon before the movers had everything unloaded and inside. The house was big, much bigger than the old house. Tall shade trees surrounded it on all sides and made the house quite dark on the inside. Peggy and Dan didn't have much time to explore. Their mother was determined to get the beds set up and the clothes, kitchenware, and groceries unpacked before dinner. It was pitch dark outside when the family had finished eating, and they were so tired that their mother suggested that they all go to bed. They could finish unpacking tomorrow and hang draperies and put down the rugs the next day. That's what I call a good idea, said Father. I'm so tired I could drop. But he wasn't too tired to help make the beds, and in no time at all everyone was ready for bed. That night, Peggy went to sleep in a strange bare room with cartons of books, pictures, and the collections of miniatures still unpacked on the floor. At first, she slept very soundly, but then she began dreaming. She dreamed that she was all alone and tied down in a dark room by something she couldn't see or feel. It was an awful feeling. She wanted to cry out, but she couldn't. She just lay there in the dark, helpless, unable to move. And then, in her dream, the noise began. It wasn't a noise exactly, but a sort of slithery sound, spooky and scary. Suddenly, Peggy opened her eyes. She realized that she was no longer dreaming. She was wide awake, but she could still hear the noise. Hardly breathing, the girl sat up in bed and peered around in the darkness. Something shadowy was moving along the wall. She hadn't dreamed it. It was there, in the room, with her. Peggy started screaming, and in a flash, her mother and father and brother came running into the room and turned on the light. The room was bare and empty, but the dog growled softly. Peggy told them what she had seen, and her father said, "Oh, come, Peggy, there's nothing in your room. Just look out the window. You're just not used to having trees outside your window. You must have heard a branch banging and scraping on the pane. I'm sure that's all it was." Her mother laughed and added, "You'll see, when I turn out the lights, that the trees cast moving shadows in the moonlight. You saw the shadows moving in the room, and that frightened you." Just go to sleep. You'll soon get used to the trees and find them comforting." Dan offered to sit in the room with her until she fell asleep again. But their father said, "It was a bad dream in a strange room. Peggy will be all right here by herself, won't you, dear?" Peggy looked doubtful and said, I guess so." So they kissed her goodnight and left. But the minute they were gone, Peggy huddled under the blankets and pulled them over her head. Then she began to shake with fright. She was sure she would hear another noise. But she was so tired that she finally dozed off. The next morning at breakfast, everyone joked about Peggy's bad dream. As soon as she was settled in her new room, they said she wouldn't imagine any slithering sounds or moving things. That evening, sometime after darkness had fallen, something went wrong with the electricity, and all the lights went out. "How do you like that?" said the father impatiently. "A fuse must have blown all of a sudden. I have to go down to the cellar and fix it." "Be sure to take a flashlight," warned Mother. "You don't want to trip over anything." "Don't worry," he promised. "The rest of you just stay where you are till I get back. I don't want you tripping over anything either." He barely left the room when the hammering started. It came from upstairs, and it sounded as if someone were banging on pipes with a sledgehammer. "Good heavens! What was that?" gasped Mother. It's probably nothing but a hot water pipe," said Dan, but his voice quivered as if he wasn't sure. "I'm scared," said Peggy, running over to her mother, who put her arms around her. "Now, Peggy," her mother said, "it's just as Dan said. This is an old house, and pipes may be clogged with rust." A few minutes later, the lights came on, and soon after, Mr. Holson came back upstairs. "Just what I thought. A blown fuse. Can't understand how it happened, though. It was brand new. And by the way, what were you three up to, anyway? You nearly scared me out of my wits. Now confess. Which one of you sneaked down after me and made those squeaking noises in the cellar stairs?" No one had time to answer or tell him about the hammering. Just then the dog came running out of the kitchen, howling and yipping and crying, his fur bristling. He headed for the sofa and dived underneath. Something had terrified him. But what? That night, nobody slept very well. The dog insisted on staying in Dan's room, and from time to time he would howl, whimper, or growl. They heard more banging on the pipes. The doors slammed downstairs. Monday was a holiday, so Dan and Peggy did not have to go to school, and their father stayed home from work. It was a gloomy, rainy day, and breakfast was silent. No one wanted to be first to talk about the disturbances of the night before. Finally, after breakfast, Peggy said what everyone was beginning to believe. "I don't like this house. I think it's haunted." "Now, we won't have any of that kind of talk," said her father sharply. "Whatever happened last night has to have an explanation. Maybe we don't know what it is now, but we'll find out." He sounded convincing, but Peggy was sure he didn't really believe what he said. A funny look came over the mother's face, and then she smiled and suggested that they go to the movies. "I think we deserve it," she said. "Besides, I think we could all do with some cheering up." After the movies, they still didn't want to go back to the gloomy house. So they ate Chinese at a Chinese restaurant and had a real feast of about 6 different dishes. It was dark when they reached the house. The drizzle had turned to heavy rain. It slashed against the window panes and drummed on the roof. The steady beat had a soothing, reassuring sound to Peggy when she went to bed, and soon she fell fast asleep. How long she slept she couldn't have said, but suddenly she was caught in the same nightmare that had terrified her so on the night she first slept in that room. Again, she was all alone, tied down in the dark, empty room, unable to move, unable to scream. And once again, she heard the fearful, soft, slithering sound. Still in the dream, Peggy took a deep breath, determined to scream as loud as she could. She woke up with a start and discovered she was screaming, so loud that she must have awakened by the sound of her own voice, though the room was almost pitch black. A faint light came from the window, and over in one corner, Peggy could see something like a huge, dark figure moving slowly. Just then, everyone came running into the room. Peggy was so frightened she couldn't talk, but when her mother turned on the light, she found her voice, and half sobbing, told what had happened. "Now, Peggy," said her father, shaking his head and pointing into the corner of the room, "don't you remember I put your mother's dress form there yesterday? Now look." He went to the corner and lifted the cape that covered it and stood aside. "See," he added, after the lights had gone out again and everyone had returned to their rooms. Dan came tiptoeing back to Peggy's bedside. "Shh," he whispered. "You go to sleep, sis, and I'll sit in the chair until you go to sleep, okay?" "Okay, Dan," she said with a sigh. "I feel better now. I'll go to sleep. Honest, I will." "Don't worry then. Just go to sleep, all right?" But after 5 minutes or so, she called out, "Dad, aren't you asleep? Do you believe me? I mean, do you believe I saw something move?" "Gee, I don't know. Maybe it was some kind of shadow from the tree outside. Who knows? Now come on, go to sleep." Peggy was beginning to get sleepy now, and so was Dan. They both dozed. Peggy huddled under her covers in the bed, and Dan in the chair. All of a sudden, the window began rattling, and the floorboards started to squeak. Peggy sat bolt upright in bed, and Dan gripped the arms of the chair. He was just about to jump up and turn on the lights when a terrible, cackling laugh filled the air. It came from the corner, and as their eyes grew accustomed to the dark, they could see, instead of the dress form, a laughing skeleton with a flapping black cape. It glowed a horrible greenish color, and it seemed to float towards them. This time they both began screaming. Their mother and father burst into the room, and everyone began talking at once. When Peggy had told what she had seen, she had Dan to back up her story. And this time their parents believed Peggy's experiences had been real. The next morning, Dan and Peggy went to their new school. When the other children had found out that they had just moved into the house on the hill, they grew wide-eyed. No one ever lived there for long, they said, because the house was haunted. That evening, Dan and Peggy told their mother and father what they had heard at school. Then their parents did some investigating of their own. As a result, before the week was over, they were packing to move from the house that didn't want anyone to live in it.